Dan Mulhollan, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you.
Why don't we start off with your background? Where did you start off, the arc of your career, and then where you are now?
I don't know if it's quite an arc, but at this, unless it's had two of every kind of animal. But I think I grew up in the south side of Chicago suburbs, and went to a Catholic high school. I was very fortunate to have won a Electric College Bowl essay contest, which the stipend paid for 4 years of college. So with that, I was able to, I had some ranges of choices, and there was a school called St. Thomas College then, now it's University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota, where if you went 3 years you can get your bachelor's, and then the fourth year, the program is going to University of Notre Dame Law School. Notre Dame and the Southside Catholic ghetto was Valhalla. So that was the game plan. And so I was taking 23, 21 credits in first class. And then I took a semester in Cuernavaca at the Centro de Investigaciones Culturales, run by a man named Ivan Illich in Cuernavaca. And that was my first time out of the country, and it expanded my horizons and perspective, and warped me that law school was no longer my goal. And I ended up being a political science major. Upon graduation, I was able to gain a fellowship at Georgetown University and started my work in Georgetown. My major was political theory, and my dissertation was the political implications of social theory of George Herbert Mead. When I completed my PhD comprehensive and passed my 2 language requirements in French and Spanish, I got a job at the Legislative Reference Service in September 1969. And one dear colleague who's still there, Walter Oleszek, had been there a year before me. And it was a momentous time with that institution, because the Legislative Reorganization Act of 1970 changed the Legislative Reference Service to Congressional Research Service and called for a significant expansion of its staff. So I was there at the ground level at a significant, if not profound, change for the legislative service for the Congress, because it also enhanced GAO at the time. 1972 was the establishment of the Office of Technology Assessment. 1974, the Congressional Budget Office was established with the Budget and Public Control Act. So it was a furtive time, and it's interesting from congressional reorganizations that you had right after World War II, Congress looked at itself and found power centralized in the executive for the war effort, and so it reasserted itself. And 46 was significant changes, and then 1970. Vietnam War, and again, a challenge nationally with regard to the divisions in the country and the centralization of power in executive. Excuse me. And then, interestingly enough, I think there was a missing moment after 9/11 with and there hasn't been the congressional focus. One could argue that in 94, with there was a joint committee on the organization of Congress in 93, and then with the Republican majority, significant changes went on in Congress, and one of which was the elimination of the Office of Technology Assessment, because the majority then felt that it was not worth the money that was expended there. And I think that each legislative service, both CBO, GAO, and CRS, are always at threat in their existence, because they continue to be viewed worthwhile by the chamber. And if the chamber changes its mind, then it changes its the assistance it sets up. I myself spent some significant time, and I appreciate the history of what legislative reference, legislative research, and then the Congressional Research Service is. And I've become just very, very fond of the institution itself. And the important element is, I think, is this notion, and this ties also to other legislatures in the states. It was the back at the turn of the century, and it was called the Wisconsin idea. And Bob La Follette, at the time governor, established a legislative reference service. And the idea was to bring up a university faculty to assist lawmakers independent of special interests. And that concept, when he became a senator in 1914, established legislative then reference service in the US Congress. And so I think today it's still read. You have a faculty of the range of disciplines who are independent, who as a source of information and analysis to members of Congress that are independent. And God knows it's needed, because the complexity of the issues across the board are increasingly refined. And at any rate, so I became a firm believer. I left in 2011, and I remain fond of the institution and the people involved.
So what was the kind of the sequence of sort of work you were doing and the positions you held at CRS? Because I think in the beginning, obviously you came in and it was a very formative time, or at least a changing time for CRS. And then when you left, you were running the place. So can you talk about, how that happened, and how did your role and your work focus change over time?
Well, I think probably a critical element was back is the hearings in 1973 of Watergate. That was, I think, in February 1973, and the committee was formed. And of course, CRS was shared staff for each of the Senate and House committees. And so there was become a significant effort on the part. I was in the government division the entire time. It was originally government and general reference. And eventually that proved, and I became a section head, and the section head reviews for balance and expertise the elements within the people in that section. That can range between 7 to 12 people, usually. And so it was in that process and trying to help the committee that I really came to be concerned about the eroding power of Congress vis-a-vis the executive, and the assertion of it was a great time to see Congress as a light, trying to dispel, in this instance, unethical and illegal activity. And from there was the impeachment process, and colleagues and I worked on that. And one of the things I personally got involved with is that writing a Senate committee print on the political philosophy of Nelson Rockefeller. And I went up to the committee sent me up to the archives, the Rockefeller archives, to help get the research done for that. And Senator Moynihan afterwards was supportive of when the librarian went for him nominated me to be the director. And talking to the Joint Committee on the Library, Senator Moynihan said, anyone who has the political imagination to write a book about the political philosophy of Nelson Rockefeller ought to be director. At any rate, I shouldn't have probably told that story, but at any rate, I worked up in the ranks of the library until in CRS, and became a division head. But in 1990, in 1992 and 93, I was deputy acting librarian of Congress. And the emphasis was on congressional relations with the Library of Congress, but I became much more aware of the breadth and the wonderful activities of an incredible institution. And the institutional library reflects the wonder of Congress. I mean, it is its own creation. One of the critical elements is the presence of the Copyright Office, and Congress likes Copyright Office being, and there's a lot of concern about having intellectual property split between patent and copyright. And but Congress likes the control of copyright, and the library likes having copyright there because of the deposit requirement, and so that it captures American creativity, that which is is copyrighted. But from its vast, the largest collection of the world, in a number of instances, the largest collection in number of languages also in the world. And it also pointed out to me that, I mean, one of the unique elements of CRS, GAO and CBO are wonderful, but they do not have foreign policy expertise. CRS does. And CRS can rely upon the language expertise and collection expertise within the library across the globe. And it's that location that helps my colleagues who have the responsibility for who currently have the responsibility for interpreting what is happening elsewhere in the world, not encounter the State Department, but along with the State Department as an independent source, if in fact a member is concerned that the current administration is coloring or not providing a balanced view. And that no matter who's in control of the administration, that is a subject concern, both the people within the party as well as the people who are on the opposite party as well. So I at any rate, I was appointed director by the Librarian of Congress in 1994 and stayed there for 17 years. And I felt at about 2011 that I was not functioning at the level that I would like to have been. I decided, okay, you're getting old enough. Let a younger person go ahead. And that basically was it as far as the service is concerned.
So when you started off, how big was what ultimately became CRS, and how big was it when you left? It
was about 350 when I started. It got up to about 1,000 with at one point. It's now, I think, roughly at 700. I think the numbers, más o menos, and it is challenging because the fact is that you look at the breadth of, I mean, the service has to maintain a funnel of folks who are interested in public service, as well whose imagination is caught by being able to help Congress write law. And what's wonderful about CRS has always had a contingency. Well, it's been for a number of years, about 60 to 70 of whom are attorneys, 60 and they are able to specialize in various law that you don't necessarily get, like separation of powers, for example, and others that are rarely coming up in litigation, but are ever present in congressional policy and policy efforts, as well as, and so that and the CRS offers a unique opportunity for the economist, the physicist, and the attorney to sit together to address one issue. And that's its crown and its cross.
And so of the 700 people you mentioned, how many of them are doing that kind of work versus other things? Because I know there's a publishing operation, and how is the head count broken down?
The number is, I don't know what the number is today. But 10 years ago, it was probably about 475 analysts, and the rest were in various roles, from research librarians, and I would include in that too, who produce reports, to those who are managing the website, a whole contingency. An important contingency for the service is summary of legislation, the bill digest function. Then there are those who are taking in the communications on a daily basis, talking to people who want to ask a question, and referring them to the expert as soon as possible, as well as managing the electronic intake and emails and other forms of requests for help, of one form or another.
And in terms of the sort of the work product of CRS, right? On the one side, there's what you said, which is this kind of ad hoc request response, right? So a member office or a senator's office or a committee calls you up and needs some research done, right? That's kind of one thing. Is that the main bulk of the work, or are there also some kind of standardized work products you make on a regular basis?
Well, the bulk of the work is that which the public would see, which is a classic CRS report, is basically a workload manager, so that people get, let's say, an analyst on a particular issue gets a series of questions. He's getting more and more questions on let's say mitigation efforts on flood control. And so he looks to see what's happening, and he knows that current legislation is pending with regard to this aspect of FEMA. And at the same time, he knows that he has getting more and more questions. He can take those questions and where the interest is, and then write a report that manages and responds to maybe 85 to 90% of those specific questions, so that you can have those out there, so that he can then spend more time on what is the critical element of CRS, and that is the dialogue with the congressional staff person or member or the personal memoranda. A lot of CRS work is individual memoranda to them, that it belongs solely to the client, solely to the member of either chamber or either party. And that's where probably a significant portion, if not the majority, of the intellectual effort on the part of an analyst goes.
So really generated at decision support or responses to member and senator offices directly, that's of a confidential kind of nature. Is that right?
Exactly.
And does that also count for committees, or is it mainly for members and senators?
It's both, and it's across the board. I mean, one of the challenges is you may have a member who, for argument's sake, is a freshman member, and he finds he has the size of 20% of his district is farmland and farmers, but he's not on the agriculture committee. But that doesn't mean that he can't not pay attention to that issue. And the farm bill, trust me, is complicated. and so he's going to have one of his legislative assistants following up on that issue and being attentive to it. And may have, let's say he has a particular commodity, peanuts in Georgia, that he has to pay attention to, and what is the support. So he has to be knowledgeable about it, even if he can have a direct impact in committee on it. But leadership generally, if they want the member to return, does their best to try to align committee assignments with re-electability on the part of the member. Yeah,
I think committees is definitely something that we should get into, because I think you've done some thinking on that subject. But maybe we can, before we jump in there specifically, can we talk broadly about, obviously a lot of your time at CRS was management, right? You're managing the institution, managing division, et cetera. But you must have had some of your own kind of areas where you developed a deeper level of expertise, or you kind of had sort of broad areas that you paid more attention to. What were the subjects that you were particularly drawn to over your career at CRS, and where did you focus?
Well, my competency, I started at Lobbying Disclosure Act and Lobbying Disclosure and reform efforts. And I was there helping the Standards Committee when it's lost its jurisdiction over lobbying disclosure. I can claim that. But that was one of the major points of CRS assistance and to the committees, which is now referred as now Judiciary Committee in both chambers. I did get involved actually personally in my personal research with informal groups in Congress, and why are they forming, and there were probably 3 or 4 academic scholarly journals that I wrote with colleagues, Paul Runquist and R. Stevens, and then Susan Webb Hammond as well, on informal groups. And they fascinated me and they had been a challenge for Congress to try to manage. There was first as legislative service organizations, then as congressional member organizations, and they still exist, and sometimes to the leadership's chagrin, because you have and like the Freedom Caucus within the Republican Party caucus, and the Democratic Study Group, or the Blue Dogs in the Democratic Party caucus as well. So that, and I think in part, one of the articles that we had written in the Legislative Study Quarterly targeted that it's the representational role that informal groups have within Congress itself. And it's the classic one would be you may be an African American in a certain state where you feel that your representative and or senator is not really attending to the concerns that you have, but you can look at, it's possible that the Congressional Black Caucus agenda, and in fact, you feel that your voice is not lost, that it's there. So there are certain caucuses that have national constituencies. And then how does that fit into the notion of representation itself? It's an interesting question.
Excellent. So those were the areas that you were personally focused on, in addition
to. I think, I guess it's fair to say that, and another area, maybe my major area, is how do congressmen learn, and how can we help them better to assimilate? They got a lot of stuff to do. And so for about a dozen of my years, at the end of every Congress, I did exit interviews for members of Congress, both senators and members of the House. And it was not too big, because no one else wants to see them when they're leaving office. So it was easier for me to get a half hour of their time or so to talk to them about how they made decisions, what was important, anything that we had done or could do to make it better. And so that was an ongoing enterprise. I have a whole host of discs on that, trying to understand how members make decisions and how we, the service or anyone, can help them in their decision making.
Do you still have those transcripts? I think we should.
Oh yeah, they're within the director office of CRS. Laying being in the library, things are always saved. That's good.
Excellent. Well, let's come back to the mention you made earlier of committees. Because I know that's one area that you've done some thinking on. Related to committees. How members are assigned to committees, the jurisdiction of committees, and you were there when there was some reorganization. So can you talk through your thoughts on the committee structure in Congress and where it is now, how it's gotten there, and what do you think of how should it evolve in the future?
Well, should have, could have, would have. I think I think the concept of committees is still as a way to manage work makes sense. And the challenge it is and one of the benefits is the building up of expertise. So you need to, and when you have term limits on leadership, that erodes the principle of expertise, which transfers the expertise to staff rather than to members, and that itself has problems, because with the new leader, you get new staff. So the whole notion of a committee expertise is eroded as well. Secondly, that said, I can't underscore the enormity of the challenges that are faced by the contemporary Congress, and the complexity, and the more help it will provide itself in admitting that, because we're dealing with proud men and women, understandably, but they need help. They need help in understanding and getting their arms around many complex matters, not the least of which could be climate change and the variations and variables about that. But back in 1993, when I was acting deputy, I testified at the Joint Committee on the Organization of Congress in '93, presenting the results of the good thinking of a number of my CRS colleagues about an ideal way to restructure the Congress. That's still out there. I think more than anything else, it's the challenge of Congress giving up power, and how you can make it worthwhile for members to give up some power, and because they've been sitting in this committee for 4 or 5 years, much less 14, 16 years, and then and now they've earned an opportunity to take a leadership on the issues they've been learning about, and now you want to take that from them. That doesn't go down well. So I think it's the change itself is a major problem. The question is how to help committees get their arms around these complex issues. Multiple referrals is a factor with time slots, so that you can being able to do so. I think another challenge, a big one, is the split between authorizations and appropriations. Dave Opie, I don't know if it was his responsibilities in the Commission of House Review, but he did propose the integration of appropriations and authorizations again, which from an appropriations chairman is a big thing. But I can speak from personal experience that the appropriators get into considerable detail about the operations of an agency, and appropriately so. But it's not necessarily tied into the law making, the authorizing committees itself. In this instance, House Rules and House Administration and Rules Administration on the Senate with regard to the library and CRS. But the committees themselves have a real challenge in managing their time, and I do think that we need to have greater time spent within the committee as committees. And I appreciate the leadership's concern with regard to the members being able to communicate with the constituents and what have you, but I think more time needs to be made in the committee process. Subcommittee, the power where the subcommittees feel their voice is heard and not overridden by the committee, and that's where the nitty-gritty can take place, and the specialization. It's interesting to me to see that, like in the British parliamentary system, they have started some of the adopted in the United States, some of the committee effort and committee structures. And I can't, but the relationship between authorization and appropriations needs to be addressed. As far as
you think they should be integrated together, authorizations and appropriations?
I think that's yes.
And
that is, and I'll look out for being shot in the next week. Yes, I do. If in fact the Congress keeps its authorization and appropriations split, the challenge is to, because the appropriations have the mandate to get the pressure to get continuing spending on it. There have been certain authorizing bills, like foreign aid authorization comes to mind, State Department authorizations, that have been delayed because of critical policy conflicts. The defense authorization is cited as the golden child because it's been able to maintain and keep up. And there have been those who have thoughtfully analyzed what elements in national defense authorization are there that allow it or to continue to get to the floor and get it enacted with the specificities. And there are, the agriculture bill is another one in the cycle, which has, for the most part, the farm bill has been renewed and renewed. I do think that biennial budgeting also is something to be considered, and has been attempted in the past as a way of helping Congress manage the workload in this day-to-day decision. But I think those are challenges to be had. I do think the role of special committees, just underscored recently with the January 6th hearings, no matter how one views it, have the capacity to focus on a particular issue. The House Committee on Modernization is another one where Congress took away itself to see what it could do to help the institution. I applaud that. I'm grateful for it. And so you do have the role of special committees on a particular issue, but that usually tends to be high profile and of a moment.
And what about the jurisdictions then of the non-special committees, right? Do you feel like that needs a radical overhaul? Do you think they should be more normalized in terms of their power? What's your opinion on the jurisdictional side of things?
Well, jurisdiction is an ebb and flow as set by precedents, and the precedents are there. I do think that the time referrals are a way to address some of those conflicting interests. And we do have to be alert to when phenomena arise that two committees or more have legitimate concern with regard to that. And so multiple referrals seems to be one avenue to address that. But I'm not adverse at all as to rethinking about the structure of selected jurisdictions. I think that one major challenge is the only expertise that the revenue committees, House Ways and Means, and on the Senate is right now, Senate Finance, is to bring in more than that, the Joint Committee on Taxation as a pooled source of expertise. I think that needs to be somehow enhanced, because more and more legislation is being written in the Internal Revenue Code, because it allows itself not to be a direct expenditure, but it's and so it's attractive to those who don't want to be seen as increasing spending, but are basically as an indirect expenditure. And so you see, I don't have the data, but I believe that in fact we have more and more elements of policy implemented there. That's a challenge. And the other institutional item that I'm rambling on here is, I think probably both chambers should seriously consider taking their legislative council and integrating them with CRS. I think that in a number of state legislatures, the legislative service is the combination of legislative drafting and legislative research. And decision was made in 1918 to separate those two out. And I'm not clear that it may well be too well set in the institution to change. This is not at all to say both legislative councils do superb work. So why break it? Why fix it if it's not broken? But I do think that it would certainly help research to have it more integrated with the lawmaking.
So what you mean is like the legislative directors and the legislative groups in member offices would be outsourced or be put in CRS?
No. What I'm saying is the House Legislative Council and Senate Legislative Council. The legislative
Leg Council, that's what you mean.
Yes, legislative drafting on both chambers in the number of state chambers, the drafting and the research are in the same office.
I see.
And I think that should happen. It's not going to happen, but I think it should.
Got it. And so in committees, what about in terms of how members are assigned to committees? Right now it's on a party basis, right? Which I always find surprising, since I find the party process to be kind of an extra congressional process, a private process, versus, one that would be, what you would think would happen within the chamber, outside of any kind of faction or group. So I'm curious your thinking on how members are assigned to committees. You've already given your opinion that you don't think there should be term limits, but what about how they get there in the first place? Should it be decided by leadership? Should it be some kind of lottery? What are your thoughts on that?
No, I think it's interesting in the political party leaders that their members get reelected. And at the same time, I understand the need for party discipline. So I have no problem with leadership and the leadership committee being involved. I think that the question is proportionality. I believe it was Gingrich who added 5 votes for himself in the Republican conference leadership for selection of chairs. That might prove to be a problem, but I presume that still holds in the Republican conference. But I can understand where it's in one instance, one of the few benefits leadership has over and above in the House and in the House and Senate is your committee assignments. And it's again in their interest that you get reelected generally. Though I'm sure that every leader would like to have one of their members disappear at some point or another. But at the same time, it can make life or political life or death for that committee assignment for a member, and in part, it can lead to significant frustration if they have a passion for a policy issue, but they don't have a venue for it. Then, hence why informal groups are as a factor, and giving them a platform to pursue, even if it's rare but not unheard of that where a measure came out of legislative, out of an informal group that ended up being submitted in the committee process and passing.
So it sounds like you're okay with the current way of assigning members to committees.
Yes, I don't. Lottery. Why should we give up to chance? It doesn't make sense if you have someone. I always remember the anecdote where Shirley Chisholm, Carl Albert introduced himself, and he assigned her to agricultural committee, I think, and of course the advantage turned out for her is that food stamps are in. And which were relevant to her urban district in New York, but I think that there is a need for political party leadership. There's a need for political party cohesion, and it's one of the main tools that afforded the leadership. So yeah.
Excellent. All right. Well, let's move on to another subject that you brought up a little bit earlier, which is the idea of how members learn, right? You said this was a pastime of yours. And I'm also very interested in this subject. Obviously they come to Congress with some level of expertise, but, it's nothing compared to the things they have to know in order to make votes, right? Or to introduce bills. There's just a tremendous amount of learning that has to happen. And a tremendous amount of information they have to distill and analyze to go pro or con any particular issue or any particular bill. So I'm curious about your perspective and how you think about how members are informed, how they identify problems, how they prioritize those, and how they debate or think through whether to be pro or con something.
Well, it's pretty straightforward. Everybody has their learning style, and you're dealing with politicians as often as not. They are people. And so as a result, face-to-face learning seems to be a dominant mode, and hence the congressional hearing. and being able to question back and forth and assess your informer. But at the same time, there's certainly members who said and staff who they would not accept anything less than more than 2 pages on an issue. And CRS learned that, in fact, it had to do short reports, short, succinct elements, offering the member or staffer more opportunity to go further into it if they so chose to. But for the most part, I can also remember one senator saying his staff would be shocked if they thought he had actually had a view on a particular issue, because it's all his decision making was corporate from his 60 staff people. But I do think that each individual member has their own style of learning. And some will read late at night, others cram on the plane going back and forth, and others feel that their loyalties and ties are more to their party, whatever, and took their cues to the party. Though many members will accede to a certain member as having taken the lead or having expertise in an issue, and saying, okay, what does Senator so-and-so or what does Congresswoman so-and-so say about this? And so that varies. I have run into a number of members who really are ready to roll up their sleeve and deal with some very complex issues, and work hard at it. But it is hard work. And I, for one, am not going to cast any stone where a member just says enough already. These are men and women who choose to help the people they represent, whether it's a state or a district, and that's why they're there. And I continue to always had thanked members for the work that they did. I remember one congresswoman telling me, "Why should you thank me? I chose this. This is what I wanted to do." But on the whole, I remain grateful to her and to everyone else, because you do take a lot of personal sacrifices being a member of Congress, and it's not easy work. And you might get first in line at the inauguration, but there's a lot of costs involved in that. And I think that we as a community need to think of ways that we can help our representatives function better, and how to help them in their decision making. And you can go on you have to start in tutorials. I remember, some members had colleagues of mine coming over for days, putting an hour on the side, getting a background on an issue for a long period of time. And then that trust was there, so they could call them over, call them and on particular questions that they had. That relationship is the best, is where a member who's involved in a particular issue feels that this physicist is really reliable when it comes to their concern on nuclear safety or nuclear power, or that this agricultural economist is really balanced and help them if they have to choose between commodities and commodity support in the farm bill that they're both sides in her district are lobbying for. What constitutes the balance between personal interests and the constituent interests and the national interest? And that requires perspectives, knowledge on the specifics in your state district, as well as knowledge national, and having to have that there for them.
So if you could design kind of a better decision support system for the member, right? Like they have all these decisions they have to make all the time, which if the primary ones are for sort of what bills to introduce and the other is how to vote. What kind of decision support system do you think would be, even better for them? Is it a bigger CRS? Is it a bigger staff of decision making? Is it some kind of someone always on call or multiple people on call to talk, to take up an issue on each side and argue it in front of the member? When you think about how they make decisions and how it could be enhanced, from a fundamental level, what occurs to you given all the observations you've made?
Well, what a critical language portion within the draft of the language of the Legislative Reorganization Act 1970 is that CRS is to anticipate the consequences of alternative provisions. That is the core of the service's work, and that's why we got involved in futurists for a while and what have you, to try to figure out, okay, not only is this language says shall rather than may, but an extensive narrative of the restrictions of the clause. What does this mean, and how can you anticipate that? That's the challenge that the Congress has made for the agency. But I do think that as we deal with greater complexity and interrelatedness of issues, how you help a member in their apprehension of issues, in part has to do with stepping back, is that they may well already have their mindset and run on a set of facts that are questionable. And they're not going to be necessarily open to any questioning something that they assume to be correct and it is incorrect. I can go back to members of whom an important constituency was tobacco farmers, and they weren't going to accept the increasing amount of information coming about the health impact on cigarette smoke. And I understood that, but how over time can you prepare members to accept which is unacceptable? That's a challenge. But then in addition, there's the whole question of making sure that the alternatives that you set out are of sufficient breadth to be inclusive, so that they won't be surprised by an option that, in fact, they heretofore had not been in the public debate. So that requires significant imagination on the part of the analyst itself. And then helping the member making some choices among those alternatives in a way of whittling down those options. I always, it in the end ends up on the decision-making style of the individual member, and having and that's why I like the whole notion of shared staff. That's what CRS is independent expertise for both chambers, for both parties, that you can rely upon and trust to present a balanced view, so that you aren't hearing a slant in one form or another. And that is critical and should remain so.
So it's interesting the way you talk about the options, right, that somebody has. That's presuming there's some kind of problem that they've identified, right? And there's several different potential legislative solutions, I guess you could call them, or different solutions that could be embodied in legislation, let's just say. And so now I understand a little bit why you're talking about integrating with Leg Council, because that's in part what Leg Council is trying to do, right? They're trying to take the idea presented by the member or the staffer and embody that into text and think about the consequences of that text for the law and maybe for the world, right? So when you think about the role of CRS in talking through options, to me that sounds like talking through different types of legislation, different options, different solutions that could be embodied in legislation. You can solve this problem by doing X or by Y or by Z, and there'll be different consequences. Is that how you envision the discussion between the member and the CRS? Like the member identifies a problem and CRS helps identify solutions that solve the problem? Or is it also on the problem side, like helping identify the problems?
Well, it's both. I have to admit, and I think twofold. One, you also have to know: is this the distinction? Is this a problem to be identified at the national level? There are a host of members who by writ of ideology and personal dispositions to have things relegated to the local government as much as possible. And so when is something elevated to a national level as a national problem as opposed to a state problem? And that is a critical component of if you were on the national legislature, and where a lot of debate begins and ends. So that's one factor involved. I also think that when you're dealing with this whole issue of trying to help members in identifying the options, some people won't see this as a problem for government at all, not just state government. And there are members who feel that health and health policy should be an individual responsibility and an individual thing, not the communities. And so that's you have to go where the member is, or where he or she is. And so that eliminates a whole host of issues. And then you say, well, Congresswoman, I understand your position. However, there still is this federal law on this health matter, and so her perspective would be, how can we extract ourselves from it, and what options does she have to get the hell out of this? So you have that kind of springboard, but again, it's from where the member is coming from, and how. And that requires a lot of attention to the specifics of his or her situation.
So it's interesting. So it's both on the problem side, and in the problem can be, anything from it's squarely within the role of Congress on a national level, to this should be pushed to the state, to this shouldn't be a problem at all that government should be able to solve. It's a personal problem. And then once you kind of get a grip around the problem, then it's figuring out the options to solve the problem if it's in the scope of the member.
Right. If it's in the scope of the member, exactly. And then that member is a representative of the United States Senate, United States House, and we have significant disagreements as to what role of government should play in many of these problems. And that's the beginning and end of some of the discussion.
And when you're thinking about the solutions, let's just say you have a problem that has different kinds of solutions. One solution is, a kind of a regulation. Another solution is to spend a lot of money on a program. Another solution is, something totally different. Does CRS as helping identify what those solutions can be if there is a problem that the senator or congressman wants to address?
Absolutely. And I one of the things that we had made an effort for those reports that were generally to all members, at the time, all members, no, generally, was to discuss the problem itself, and then make a commitment that if that problem was decided to be a national legislative issue, then to track that national legislative issue as it proceeded, so that you would have the report if it went to the subcommittee, and then there were alternatives. Make sure that someone's reading that report would know what the subcommittee's options were. And then if a decision was made by the subcommittee, make sure the report was up to date, so when it would move to the full committee. And if it was more than one committee, to do the same if it was multiple referrals, or one committee before it came to the floor, and do the same for the other chamber, both in that chamber subcommittee that came and to keep up, which was a lot of pressure, particularly when you have a highly active issue, to keep that up to date. But that's the commitment and responsibility. And so I've had colleagues who work way into the night and early in the morning to make sure that, in fact, the research was up to date for where the decisions were being made. That said, that a question of currency is, and where it is extremely important. And because that time decisions can be made very quickly, sometimes incredibly slowly, but both. And you have to get the pace of things. But there are sometimes the gestation for a legislative idea take 7-8 years, and sometimes 7 or 8 months, depending on the exigencies of the moment.
And when there's different alternatives to solve a problem, is CRS's role to think through those alternatives and their budgets and all that kind of thing, or do they get into that level? Is that something that then moves over to the CBO to score it and figure out the cost?
Well, the CBO, just step back a little bit. Government Accountability Office is basically program evaluation. CBO is budget analysis, and CRS is policy analysis. And obviously, there is overlap in all these functions and examinations. But cost and what have you is the responsibility of CRS to set out sometimes what costs may be, but it's the analysis of the CBO that is the bottom line as far as counts as far as the rules and procedures in undertaking the legislation. That said, each of the support agencies have significant responsibilities as far as helping in those decisions. There are some members who basically have one question with regard to any piece: how much does it cost? And that's legitimate concern on their part. And CBO is the reliable and trusted source for that assessment. The Government Accountability Office has the enormous challenge of how are the programs of the Congress is enacted functioning, what's going well, what is not going well, and identifying options to help improve that, given what the legislative intent was in the law. And one of the initiatives, I think just in the last 2018 or what have you, was the Office of Strategic Initiatives, where GAO is attempting to do some projections of longer term of and again, trying, I think even trying the nascent, it's always been nascent, the discipline of futurology, and trying to see if there's any extrapolations that can be of help in trying to see long-term consequences as a program implementation unfolds in one form or another. And it's to their credit. CRS tried it, I think in earlier discussion, mentioned to you, trying to project future anticipations of what it is, and employed some futurists. It just didn't work out that well. The discipline may well have a future, but it's still unwieldy. And no offense to the futurists out there, but it is a responsibility to anticipate and how do you do that, and that's where significant imagination and creativity comes in the policy process, is trying to figure that out.
Well, speaking of the future, so what do you think the future is of these support agencies, right? You mentioned how CRS grew and then was pulled back a little bit. The other agencies, support agencies, where do you see it going in 50 years plus for these agencies? Are they going to grow? Are they going to become more support, or is Congress going to, cut back on them and just be doing all constituent engagement and less policy making? Where do you see it evolving?
Well, no, it's an excellent question. The elimination of the Office of Technology Assessment is a good example. It was about 120 people, where no one should take existence of for granted. And there were several occasions in my career where a member was wanted to zero out CRS out of the budget, and we were protected. But there may be at some point where it isn't protected. They really tick off a member, and he or she well placed, and that could be it. That's part and parcel of the legislative process and politics as it is today. I do think that that one would probably, just with one of the great institutions that still survives, is the Library of Congress. And I do think that the library has a future in the next 50 years, as do I think GAO. Whether CRS and CBO or CBO is tied into the budget and reconciliation budget process, and Congress recognize that somehow it has to have a handle on its spending and the efficiency and efficacy of its spending. And so I think by large, the CBO has been able to maintain its integrity as an institution, and has been really, really hard. CRS, I think, is protected by being in the Library of Congress to some degree, because the library is seen as a nonpartisan entity, and I think is aided by that. But how Congress is going to look like in the next 50 years is going to depend on so many factors that and what Congress is going to look at like. It looked like the same institution for a number of years until right when I started in the 70s, it started changing significantly, and that's not bad. I think that it has to respond to its environment. I think whatever it takes for the legislature to be able to function, and that for the people to feel as if they are being represented in the decisions that are being made. I do believe that somehow the institutions have to allow more give and take, both in committee and on the floor, so that people can hear someone advocate how they think, even if they are voted down. And not having that voice and that presence from their viewpoint in the debate, I think, is corrosive. And that at some point there has to be the institution willing to pay the price of efficiency in order to make sure that inclusivity, people's voices are heard, and heard on the floor and in committee hearing. But to the question of the next 50 years, I think a huge amount will depend on how we educate our citizenry in the next 50 years. And that, I mean, I'm heartened by and hopeful for the efforts on the part of civic education and those who are making an effort, that the young people today, starting from elementary school all the way through, understand their responsibilities as a citizen. And when I retired, I have made a good faith effort to roll up my sleeve and look at the Alexandria City Council agenda and what have you. God, it's so much detail, a lot of work. I think I say, God bless those people, but to somehow to be a responsible citizen and to try to pay attention to how our corporate decisions are being made is part of what we need to do as an individual person and as a member of the community. And we somehow have to instill that sense of responsibility in our education system for the future. And how that can be done, there's a goodly number of people making yeoman efforts towards that, and I applaud it. But we need that for the next, to see what the institution is going to look like in the next 50 years.
And in terms of the support agencies, do you think they'll be bigger, smaller? They'll have more responsibility? They'll be marginalized? What do you think?
I can't tell you what I think. I can tell you what I hope, because I just don't have. I've lost my capacity to project what's going to happen in the next 5 months, much less the next 5 years, or much less 50 years. I would like to see Congress accept that it has to spend more money on itself, more money for staff salaries, which is starting, more money for itself and the complexity expanding on personal and legislative staff. 18 full-time and 4 part-time for the House has been standard for a long period of time. You've got what? You have 7 states with 1 representative. Montana until just now had over 1 million people and had 1 member of the House, but the same as the 13th district is always cited out in New York, which is the smallest compact physically. That they need help both with regard to outreach to their constituents and learning what the constituents are, but also as much outreach and saying, okay, what are the legislative issues that impact the district or state, and the staffing for that. And I do believe shared staff is a way of expanding on that capacity, and CRS should be part of that. But whether it's an analysis of how a program is functioning, and are we giving sufficient resources to that, to the GAO, or I know the earlier leadership of CBO, and I think still they feel that in fact they need to stay at 250. They felt that that basically was the right number for them. I don't know if that has held by the current leadership, but I myself feel that the problems are legion, and there is only so much time in the day, and I think more expertise is needed than there is allocated now.
So one other question I have is related to something you brought up earlier about, the UK Parliament or the states, legislatures. What can Congress and how should Congress learn from these other institutions, right? Congress seems very sort of insulated from sort of what I would call competitive intelligence, right? Trying to understand how do other countries do it, and how do the states do it, and how can we improve the way we do it based on our learnings, right? So I'm curious your perspective on that, and how do they figure out what's going on around the world and in the states, and how can they actually implement the good stuff into Congress itself?
One of the major differences between the Congress and most other parliamentary bodies in the world is that research capacities generally are in the political party structures. And so that's the political party. And so a number of issues are more comfortably aligned with ideology in European parties, whether it's the Green Party or the Christian Democrats in Italy or Germany, whatever, or the Socialist Workers Party. You have an alignment of party ideology, and the research is the avenue. Interestingly enough, right after World War II, then LRS sent representatives to both Germany and to Japan. And they set up their own parliamentary research service modeled on legislative reference research service then. And I've been to both Germany and to Japan, and they see the relationships in the past, and I've always been fascinated to see how they have done their work in their own, and they reflect their political systems and structures respectively. But they have been able to maintain, interesting enough, a sense of objective expertise in both countries and both political systems, which is kind of cool, and also reflects maybe it's actually a good idea that it has something that has some universal applicability. Newt Gingrich had the idea of establishing a dialogue with international parliamentarians and members of the House. I don't think that idea went very well. There was not an organizational structure. There's the interparliamentary associations and members are active in it. And the House particularly, in the end, it was both Dave Dreyer of California and then from North Carolina, the Congressman Democrat, who took the leadership on the parliamentary efforts to help other countries' parliaments and to learn from that, and started with the democracy effort in '89 in Poland and Eastern Europe and Czechoslovakia and in the East, the former Soviet Union. And so you had some efforts on the part of Congress to do that. On my part, I became a member of the International Federation of the section, parliamentary library section, and on the board. But for the most part, to be perfectly frank, the resources given to parliamentary research services, even in the House of Commons library, was small in comparison to the United States. And so you're always the big man on campus or big woman on campus, and the scales doesn't offer as much. But there was some still exchange of ideas in one form or another that I think that is of help. But I do think that over time, American exceptionalism will not be viewed as paramount, because right now, of course, the United States is not, there's not a lot of parliamentary bodies comparable to the U.S. Congress and the power that it holds. And, but on the other hand, on the states, as I said, the legislative reference services origins were in the legislative movement. So we have, for some period of time, sorry about the noise out there, we have a time of significant correspondence of some state legislatures and the U.S. Congress. And the classic notion is that they're the states are the laboratories to which Congress can learn. And one of the funnels for membership in the House are people who served in their state legislatures. That still holds. And they come from that expertise and that experience. And they bring how we did things in Idaho or Illinois to the U.S. Congress and saying, hey, this is different. Why? Or comparable. And I think the interchange of those legislatures, we don't do the job that we should have with the National Conference of State Legislatures, in part, I think, because members of the House see, to be frank, view them as potential competitors. As if I enhance this state Senate leader, maybe at some point he's going to be a challenge for me in the future.
Yeah, that makes sense. And in terms of the parliamentarian aspect, it's also interesting to see what happens in the local and how that can be or not be applied in the U.S. Congress. Since at least today in the House, it's so driven by leadership. So it's hard to get lessons and incorporate them, I would think.
Or state legislatures envy and the leadership model that's currently there. Yeah, and at times quite reflected, and even stronger leadership in certain state legislatures.
Right. Well, great. Well, I think it's time for us to move on to the common questions I ask all of our guests. If you're ready to move on to the next phase, so I can someday compare the answers.
Yeah, good luck in the comparison.
Well, the first question here is something you mentioned earlier a number of times, which is this notion of representation. So, this is a personal question to you. What do you think congressional representation should mean? And are you a Burkean, or are you a, who are they representing in the district? Is it the primary vote? Is it everyone? Is it future generations? Where do you come down on what representation should mean to our leaders?
Well, I think it's when citizens are present in public policy decision-making, when the political actors undertake the best interests of the citizens. And so I think there isn't one decision that at some point there is, members of a constituency don't have an opinion on selected issues that a member has to make. So let's say, within the committee process itself, they have to make a decision on reform effort in the chamber. They're not going to have a decision. You have to, so that there is at some point a reliance on the integrity of that member. And I think built into the notion of a representative is being fair and doing their best effort to discern what the people want. I think there are some efforts going on, and that is a work of the Lord, is efforts that are being undertaken to get select members of a constituency, provide them all a basic understanding of a policy issue, and then having them discuss it. That's going on, and it's music to my ears. But to have the people motivated to undertake their time and effort to that is both impressive, but at the same time, I'm leery because the type of intensity that calls for can also call for people who are have a point to be made no matter what. That said, there needs to be more of an effort to get coverage of the Congress and what it is doing out to the people. When, for me personally, I'm a professional researcher and have trouble finding out what's happening in Richmond right now when the legislature is active. I could pay for some services that track that. I don't think that should happen. I think news organizations should put someone there and effort to do so. Annapolis, I can find out more. Post is better about coverage than what's happening in Annapolis, but still not adequate if I were a Maryland resident, and much less the city council and the district. So I think that journalism needs to up its ante, and I know its resources and that they're under constraints and what have you, to do better coverage of decision-making within the legislative bodies. We have Congressional Quarterly. It does a superb job. It's also expensive. And how to get the kinds of resources necessary out to the general public that are provided now in the Congressional Quarterly is a challenge.
So it sounds like on the representation question, you believe in judgments. Members and senators are there to make judgments on behalf of their constituents rather than just be a window into their constituencies' current beliefs. And then on the other side, you mentioned all citizens. I'm assuming that means all constituents within a district versus a faction within the district. Is that right?
Yes and yes. I mean, first of all, I cannot see how a member can purely represent his or her district, because there isn't a district that someone represents doesn't have diversity of views. And so they're obviously feel that they're there to represent a coalition of viewpoints. And some members are in a very diverse district, and others are homogeneous with regard to an issue or is concerned. But I also feel that, in fact, that when you make the decision to saying my constituency views this, it's rare that you're going to do that. It's against your own personal beliefs. And so they can, and if they do that, that is, I think, rare and not necessarily in the long run, so it could be corrosive to that individual's self-integrity and motivation to be making decisions that they don't agree with, but they know their constituents want. That can be hard.
Right. Well, the next question is, how would your ideal Congress allocate its time? And by this, I mean in DC versus back in the district. It means in committee versus on the floor, dialing for dollars. Where do you see them? Is it 2 weeks on, 1 week off? Where do you see that as being an ideal place based on your experience in observing Congress?
Well, I think it's 2013, the Congressional Management Foundation did a survey of how members allocate their time. And I was surprised by that because the major find, if I recall correctly, it was that they had a significant different allocation when they were in their constituency and when they were in the city. And I think it was 35% was legislative policy in the city and only 12% out, and 17% constituent services and 32 out. But then there's the political campaign, about the same, 17 and 18%. And I've heard from members complaining bitterly about the time they have to spend on the phoning. And it's a common lamentation of congressional observers, how much time is spent. But if 2013 is not all that different 9 years ago from now to today, 18 or 17% of their time on political campaign, presumably, and presumably that's where the fundraising was captured, isn't all that bad. 9% in the city, 14% back at home on press media. Interesting enough, even when you're at home or in the city, 9% for family and friends. And managerial stuff, 7.7. That makes sense. I was kind of surprised because increasingly, at least for the House, a good number of members, majority of their staff is in the district, not back at in the city, in this district, and that is not a bad thing. I mean, that you've got to have your hands on the pulse of the people and problem solve and help them in their casework and what have you. Only 6% and 8%, 6% in the district and 8% was personal time. I myself would be reluctant to saying, hey, you need to take less personal time than 6% or 8% of that, and you have your waking hour on that. And I understand the administrative and the family, and I can't separate out press media from political campaigning itself. And so that's a constant. So I don't know where to give on that. The fact that they spend a little over a third of their time on legislation when they're in the city, I think probably they should stay more in the city longer. You can't get away from the fact that you're dealing with immense problems, immense challenges, and it just takes time to assimilate. And certainly you can read briefing papers from your staff while you're transit back and forth. But at the same time, whether it's the town hall meeting or a Chamber of Commerce dinner or or high school graduation or whatever, you are constantly interacting with the constituency is very important. But my prejudice is the job itself, and that is legislation and work. And I think
increase that legislative time.
I'd like to see more of the work week being the work week.
Great. So the next question is really about how should debate, deliberation, or dialogue occur or be structured in Congress? And earlier you mentioned that minority views or dissenting views need to be voiced in the Congress. So how do you see that happening? Is it committee? Is it the floor? How should this debate and dialogue happen?
I in both chambers and in both and in committees, there needs to be an increasing amount of opportunity for dialogue in the committee and deliberations in the committee process. And I think that the broadcasting of hearings is a good thing. I think that I do not know if open hearings is the most efficient way of a member learning about a problem or an issue. I think that committee briefings can take place aside from public hearings. And public hearings have their place. and it's on the record, but I think that there could be more opportunities for members to gather to learn about an issue within the committee process and the give and take and members being asked. Members, once they're sometimes act differently when they're on a broadcast venue, and they feel obligated to present a viewpoint or themselves in a way that they hope is enhancing. And that lends itself not necessarily to learning more about the problem itself.
Understood. And so you think that, and we've talked about this on the program many times, about this concept of transparency versus privacy in deliberation. It sounds like you're a fan of at least some kind of privacy under different circumstances that would enhance that dialogue process.
Absolutely. And that runs counter to a number of people's strongly held views.
Right.
But I keep on thinking about, the principle of executive privilege is pretty well ensconced in legal practice. But I do think there is an equally compelling principle of legislative prerogative as well. And members need sometimes to be able to be open to discussing issues without necessarily at this point having to respond already because they're considering something that someone considers anathema in the district.
Right.
They have to, and that restricts their thinking.
Great. So next question, I think you started to talk about earlier on the future, but what fundamental institutional improvement should Congress make within a 50-year time frame?
Back to what I pointed out before, I think that the fundamental work is not within the institution itself, but in the people who feed the institution, and that is that people who vote for members of Congress. And that's why I've come to really feel that one of the reforms that are important is ranked choice voting, and to be able to advocate that at the federal and local level. It allows better opportunities for choice and nuance in the decision making for selecting a candidate. And I think that is important. But in the 50 years is instilling in our children who are growing up the importance of what it means and the responsibilities of what it means to be a citizen, and recognizing that it's work involved, and that's part of the notion of duty, and not only getting out and voting, which is certainly important. And I am discouraged by the voting participation right now in the younger generations. But in addition to what responsibility there is to follow. And I'm not an educator, God knows. And so, but at the same time, I really do, and I know there's a lot of hardworking teachers right now teaching American government in our high schools, what have you. And God, during the 2016 primary, I was thinking how difficult it would have been to be a social studies teacher and maintain traditional decorum. But at the same time, we really need to have a national effort towards improving our civic education and the responsibility of citizenry. I'll leave it at that.
Right. Next question is, what book or article most shaped your thinking with respect to congressional reform?
I suppose the Bible. No. There hasn't been one. I do want to recommend Congress and its Policy and Procedures work. It's by Walter Oleszek and his son Mark, and two colleagues of mine, Bill Heniff and Elizabeth Rebecki. It's a great beginning of understanding Congress and how it works, both chambers. And so it's just that if someone who is earnest and wants to just understand Congress and its operations better, I would recommend it. There has not been any article or that's really hit me on reform because it's reform itself is a is a laden term that's why you also talk about congressional reorganization instead. But it's a question of good, better, best, never let it rest. And I am more inclined these days. My readings are much more of a generalized basis rather than focused on politics, except on the international level.
Great. So the last question is really about your plans. Any more books working on the civic education piece? Involved in local politics. What do you have on the horizon?
Again, the most important thing is supporting. There's an organization called Fair Vote, and it's I would contend that it is more a very important national organization trying to advocate for ranked choice voting within our elections. And I would point to that, my support of that, as a useful enterprise. I myself am doing my best to get my arms around a whole host of literature that I avoided for the last 4 decades, and recognizing the right side of my brain more, and as well as building up lost language expertise that I'm trying to rebuild again, particularly in Spanish these days.
Wow. Well, David Mulhollan, thank you so much for your time. It's been fantastic. Thank you for your service to the country and your work on Congress, and best of luck with all the work you have coming.
And thank you again, as I said before, thank you for your work and your effort and looking at Congress and trying to help the institution. I appreciate that.
Thank you.